Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This week's show, we're talking about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Evil. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. First and foremost, I liked this episode. I love how they did the intro where it's like, all right, this is like the book of like, pop-up demons and so on and so forth. Flipped it upside down, the book of angels. I was like, oh, is that what the back half of this season is going to be? It's probably just this one episode. It'd be really interesting if we did like half the episode half the season like was a pop-up book of demons, the other half was angels, but maybe it's just this episode. Either way, I thought that was kind of a nice twist. That'd be interesting. Once again, it's like they are diving more and more into the angel thing because obviously it's been sporadic over the past 2 seasons, but now they're like leaning into it even more so with David's visions and stuff. So first and foremost, let's talk about Cheryl. I love it that Helena comes in and is like, who the hell are you? And it's like, where's Taylor? It's like, well, Taylor got replaced. I love it's cool that Cheryl actually has someone that is working with her and helping her out, whereas Taylor was there to spy on her and undermine her. But it's like, yo, she's doing great. Like the fake cryptocurrency she's pushing is up like 45, and she's doing like, they're kicking up the whole trolls of like, doom scrolling, which is like sad because obviously it's personally affecting her grandchildren, because that all this stuff, because they're dealing with like, the fallout of like the building and stuff like that, which we'll talk about that later. But that building collapse, like they're pushing a lot of that doom scrolling like news and just doing everything they can. It's like it's affecting her grandchildren, but she doesn't care, which is also kind of sad. But then she gets in there trying to talk to the manager. I love that she was able to convince that guy by being like, I'm going to give you 400 of these coins and they're worth, that's going to be about $10,000. He's like, make it 500. And it's like, okay, fine. And you get me in there right now. He's like, okay. Also, tell him that he looks great because he's been trying to lose weight or something like that. I was like, oh boy, the moment she goes in there and the room's starting to smell, I'm like, is he eating people or something? I was like, what's going to happen? And the moment you get a little glimpse of it, I was like, oh God, he's a demon. I was like, oh, well, of course he is. And then Cheryl's just like, I was like, yeah! I was like, I love it. This show enjoys messing with its main character so damn much. I mean, it's like, Andy literally saw his first demon, like a couple episodes back. So Andy got hit by it. Kurt's still processing all that he's seen. Kristen's seen one. So is Ben. I mean, Ben literally just had his crisis about 2 episodes ago about dealing with everything, being like, this is too much. Like, the weight of what they do is starting to finally make him crack a little bit. But now she's just kind of like, and she's taking it in strides. And then she sees that guy later on, the guy that's kind of over her, or maybe the guy that's under her, that she kind of blackmailed him into kind of falling in line as well. Well, threatened to blackmail him. And it's like, what does that guy look like to you? It's like, well, other people say he looks like Liam Neeson. I say he looks like that. What's that guy from The Good Place? Ted Danson. He's like, Ted Danson. I was like, to anyone that's never seen The Good Place, there are layers upon layers to that joke. This will involve a spoiler to The Good Place, but if you haven't seen it, spoilers, I'm sorry. It's funny because Ted Danson's character, Michael, ends up being revealed to be a demon. So it's like, there are extra layers to that. And I'm wondering, does she she was almost like, Ted Danson, like, it's almost like she understood the irony of him saying that. And it's like, yeah. It's like, how many eyes do you see? He's like, how many eyes? 2 eyes. How many do you see? It's like, yeah. She's like, right. And she's like, she's losing her mind about this. Go visits him later, has to give him a bat scratch. He's like, oh, you get don't fuck this up. I love the whole thing of like, oh, you're going to be in my office noon tomorrow, don't fuck this up. And she's just like, it's like, is no one else singing this? Am I going crazy? So when she goes to see him later on, she has to like scratch his back. And then it's like, oh yeah, you're going to get the promotion. And then he slaps her ass. So I'm like, okay, so she has to deal with sexual harassment from a demon. But I'm also like, well, demons are supposed to be scumbags. So it's like, of course, a scummy person, like maybe to everyone else, because she's neck deep in all of this. I mean, she was getting those injections all last season, so maybe that also played a role. I mean, she's already been tiptoeing towards this evil side of things since like season 1, and now it's like finally crossed over. But she's never been in a position to see a demon, like, because Leland isn't a demon, he's just a human, God, what's the word? Liaison of sorts. That's kind of all his role is. So he's an evil human being, but he's not a demon. He's just an evil human. And I mean, at least that's how I'm interpreting that. I don't think they're saying Leland is a demon. But then you also have then you have to think about like the demon households. Like, do they technically count as demons, or are they just regular people who become liaisons to like the demon homes or something, that demon houses or something like that, or I don't fully know how that really works. Either way, because I was like, she's just never really been in a position to be around demons per se to fully see them in all their glory. But now she is, and she went to see Leland. It's like, oh, you went to see the manager. It's like, what happened? It's like, I got promoted. It's like, okay. How do you see him? It's like, the same way you see him. She's like, how many eyes does he have? And then Cheryl holds up 5 fingers, and it's like, she's like, am I having a psychotic break? He's like, yes, you are. Welcome to the team. It's like, Team Evil. Mermaid Man. SpongeBob has forever ruined that for me. You can never scream the word evil without saying it like Mermaid Man. Evil. Anyway. I did a terrible Mermaid Man impression there, but regardless, I just love how she's handling this, and it's like, well, I guess maybe they're trying to say like, oh, seeing demons is part of the psychosis of all this, and welcome to the team because you finally went on to that side. Maybe it's like, oh, maybe, and that's always been like this interesting thing of maybe craziness is kind of seeing the world for what it really is. Maybe the spin they're going with that. I have no idea. So, at the beginning of this episode, circling back, we had this whole situation where a building collapsed. It was a terrible situation. A lot of apparently 134 people died. But these 2 particular people saw a woman carrying a lamb, leading them out of the building. It turns out there are actually 4 people in general. 2 of them could have potentially interacted, 1 didn't, and I don't think they had gotten to the 4th one yet. So they're bringing those people in because the Monsignor, in general, the church wants to know, is it this particular saint who's kind of been known to create she healed like a spinal injury or something like back years ago. I think she died in like 1952. She's a Sicilian a nun, but yeah, so it's like, right, they want to find out if she exists, because if she exists, this could be another example of her miracle. So getting everyone to kind of talk about everything. Obviously, Kristen's like, right, there's a truck, like a food truck or whatever, and it's got lamb or at least the sign says lamb, and the guy's like, oh, so you're thinking I saw a food truck or whatever that says lamb, and I imagine being saved by a woman carrying a lamb. And David, Ben, and Kristen are almost kind of like, yeah, that's kind of our theory, because it's like, because she chalks it up to impending doom, that like whether you realize it or not, there's some subconscious part of your mind that recognizes something is not right, and it manifested itself in this way of saying like, hey, get out of here. But then it's like, well, the third person, she literally got a phone call warning her to get out. But at the same time, David's having his visions, and this time that person tells him to run. Then Kristen hears something saying, watch out. But then she hears from her mom that apparently she's done that when she was younger too. And it's like, yeah, it's like, oh, maybe it's this voice is telling you to run away from Andy, because she's like, yeah, kind of like end it all because you could do better. It's like, well, to be fair, Andy's kind of the biggest like issue. Like, you and Kristen are good, but Andy's kind of the big issue. He's the one that convinced Kristen to kick you out and everything. So it's like, yeah, you have your ulterior motives for her. I mean, her and Andy never got along, and it's just gotten worse the more like Cheryl shifted to the dark side. So I just think that's fascinating. So Kristen's not really sure what to do about that. Plus, she's not sleeping well because of that. Plus, the girls are upset because of all the doom scrolling they were doing, worried about because of the building collapse, worried about the train above their house is going to collapse in their house and everything. So, but Kristen like helping them by like, right, that night they all went outside. Well, because they tried to contact Andy, but he kept breaking up. So that wasn't a no-go. It's just like, once again, sending Andy so far away to make Kristen a little bit more vulnerable to, like, I guess Cheryl's persuasion, and making her, like, Kristen probably, like, put things in perspective. I mean, for one, they needed the money to remodel the house and everything, but it's just like, things keep coming up to keep them apart, just because I guess it's easier to invade Kristen and the kids, because most of that ends up happening when Andy's not around. So obviously, some of it happens while Andy's around, but most of it's while he's away. So I think that when the family's not fully united, it kind of lowers their defenses, I guess, on maybe like some spiritual level, and puts them in a vulnerable state. The kids, as well as Kristen, in a state to be surprised and kind of knocked off kilter, when it comes to all of this. But Either way, like her grabbing the rocks and telling the kids like to scream at the train that it's never going to scare them again. I'm like, at first, some idiotic part of my brain's like, oh man, I hope they don't throw those and end up breaking glass, breaking like the windows on the train. But it's like, no, the tracks are like so high in the air, like there's no way they're going to hit like I don't know why. I guess in my head I was thinking the tracks were lower than what they were. I guess just because of the lights coming down from the train, it's just like, as well as just like how high up, like how loud it is. For whatever reason in my head I'm thinking it's like, no, it's just proximity. It doesn't have to necessarily be proximity vertically, just like horizontally, just in general area in that regard. Of course, like it's going to be that loud, but either way. So circling back. So all this is going down, and then their fourth person brings up the fact is that the angel she saw was black. Now we start getting into that interesting territory where the Monsignor's like, well, no one else said the person was black, so like we should double check that, because they're like, well, the person who drew it was black, right? And it's like, and it's like, yeah, but maybe she's trying to make a political statement. And it's like, he's like, this isn't meant to be political or whatever. Just Kristen and Ben are just like, wow. And even David's like, oh, wait, so angels can't be black? And Monsignor's like, I'm not saying that. And it's just like, yeah, it's a complicated situation. And even David kind of points out, like, right, like all throughout history, people have made, these religious figures always look white, just, and Ben's like, oh yeah, of course, like they'd make figures look more like themselves, so they're like, right, these higher power billions, like, of course they look more like us, the people in power. So, but David's like, right, like he had shown a picture of Saint Monica. It's like, you have to dig deep to find like a real picture of Saint Monica, because she was African, and it's like, yet she's still depicted as white. And he's like, yeah, her skin would be just as dark as mine is. So this time, David was looking through books, seeing all these different holy figures and angels and stuff represented as white. He had his vision again, and this time the angel he saw was black. But that makes him question himself even more. It's like, right, I'm having this whole conversation, like, the fact of the matter is, if these angels could be anything, then why do I always, any vision I've always had, have them being white? And now that I'm kind of questioning that, like, he's starting to think maybe it's a psychological thing. Like, I've been so focused in my head about, like, oh, these angels, like, being black, that I have now warped my visions to kind of replicate that. Andrea's kind of saying, like, no, it's all kind of part of the process or something like that. If they change, it's because God. But for David, it's just him struggling. It's like, but for so long, he's believed in these visions. He's going through, like, to be fair, initially, his visions came about because he got high. And that made you go, like, that's why in the beginning, first season, you're like, oh. Because you're like, David has visions. You're like, okay. But then you find out he gets high to have those visions. And you're like, oh. So couldn't it just be you having, like, you're going on a drug trip every time you're having your visions? But because we know that, like, drugs were kind of his thing back in the day too. So, but now it's like, right, because Andrea made him kind of stop doing that, and he still had these visions. So it's like, okay. And he starts wondering later on, like, well, how do I know it's God sending me these visions? That's what I was wondering last episode too. I was like, how do you know it's not just demons perpetrating in the form of, like, these angelic visions just to kind of steer you down the wrong path? But Andrea's like, no, these are God's. These are visions sent by God. You're having them for a reason. So, either way. So, while this is happening, they're continuing their investigation to the angel thing, and the third person, they put her under hypnosis, and it turns out she was told to get a message to David. And that is the thing of, like, oh, she didn't give the message to David, not because the thing was in a different language, which I'm like, why introduce it and say it was a different language? But she's like, oh, I didn't know what David I was supposed to be meeting, so I interpreted it that way. But I'm like, because she didn't know to David, it's like, oh, I just, in my head, I made it so that I just told myself, like, oh, it was in a different language just because I didn't know what it really meant. Because maybe she was trying to say, like, oh, if I told you it was really for a guy named David, you would have thought I was crazy. Either way, it's kind of like, now they're wondering, like, and especially because the message was, don't trust your sister, and you're like, oh, it's hey, but I don't have a sister. It's like, could this be about Sister Andrea? I was like, no, what's going on? And then we find out the rub of it all, she works for Leland. I was like, oh, of course, because Leland, I love that Andrea and them, they're like, they're in the room, and the other priests and stuff are there, and like, she peeks and looks over at Leland, and he kind of does a, like, slit throat thing towards her, and she's kind of like, okay. So it's like, right, Leland set all that in motion, and now they're immediately told, move on to another case, because it's like, why does it, and David's like, being frank about it, why does the church have such an issue with an angel being black? And he's like, yeah, here's a demonically possessed girl who's eating glass. Get to it. And it's like, yet another case, we're just moving on. Because it's like, yeah, because this one person ended up being untrue, we kind of have to discount the others. But it's like, no, that's still 3 other viable people. Why is this one person's deception, like, you know, why does that count? And they don't get an answer. But it's like, because the church doesn't want to lean into the possibility. Because the reason why, because that would throw everything into turmoil. Because they probably don't want to admit it, but there's the subtle element of people in general. This is how, because by saying like, oh, these particular figures are black, you're going to ostracize a lot of Christians who be like, who look at it as like, oh, this is blasphemy, this is BS. And I think that's one lane of it. But 2, it's an institution that's existed in this particular form for so long. Once again, to find the real, like he had to find the real photo of Saint Monica, you have to dig deep for it, right? So they want to keep things simple, don't want to confuse people, is what it comes down to. It's just, that's how I'm interpreting that. So that's really interesting. So, but before she left, what was her name, Jess? She ended up saying like, yeah, you notice that people are getting angrier, hitting each other on a plane. I'm like, oh, that has to be a commentary on like a lot of shit's been going down on planes for the past year or so. So it's like, I mean, longer in fact. But just it does seem like it's escalating. It's just people hitting each other kind of for no reason, like people popping off. And it's like, yeah, you know what that is? That's a sign of you guys losing. Also, that feeling of dread you're getting and doom, yeah, you're feeling it for a reason. Which hits Kristen hard because she's been feeling that dread like something's wrong, but she can't quite place it. Now we see why. Her mom's kind of helped tributing to that, but she doesn't contributing to that, but she doesn't know at the time what she does, because she doesn't really know what her mom really does. If she does, I'm sure that she'd have a big issue with that, but we'll see. Especially once again, her daughters were caught doom scrolling this episode because of stuff Cheryl was kind of helping put out there. So, nevertheless, the other side of this episode involves Andrea, David being her representative, and obviously Kurt gets brought in, and David had a question, and it's like, okay, what about the demon you saw? But Andrea was like, don't do that. Do not push him on that. She's like, I don't want to win my case this way. And Kurt looked at her and thanked her, because for her, it's like, yes, the point is she wanted him to accept what he saw, yes, but she wants him to get there in time. Don't push him into a corner into admitting it. It's like, no, because I think for her, she knows that's just going to send him spiraling. And it's like, he's already having issues with it, coming to terms with what he's seen, because even he can't really understand it. So pushing him before he's able to fully come to terms with what it is and recognize it as a demon or whatnot, to push him before he's ready, she doesn't like that. And obviously David coming with all his concerns and even putting himself in a position where he could end up, because he's like, right, everything Andrea saw, I saw as well. I think he said this in particular, but he's like, Sister Andrea, let the men talk. It's just kind of, and she's almost like, ugh. Like, I thought, I was like, oh, that's a wild ass line to say, but I think he was kind of making a point. But it's like, especially David was like, yeah, if you're going to get rid of her, you're going to have to get rid of me. One of the 3 black priests that you kind of let into the church, that you've let be priests in this past year. And just Leland got up being like, ugh. He was just like, he's just disgusted. It's like, so there you go, David, playing the race card. Okay, I see how it is, and leaves. And Andrea, so it does seem like everything's pretty kosher going forward. And it's like, right, you lied about seeing the demon that the cardinal was talking to, like I said, so go confess. And he's like, I'll do it tomorrow. She's like, no, do it now. The fact is, and I thought it was kind of interesting, because David says that he wishes that he had her certainty, but she's like, no, your doubt is what makes your faith stronger. I think that's such an interesting thing, because it's like, right, I think if you can make a non-believer, because either she's trying to say like, right, by having your doubts, combining that with your faith, and it will make it that much stronger, because once your faith kind of disproves and like gets rid of all that shadow of doubt that you have, it'll make your faith that much stronger. Or having doubts is a good thing because that's a part of your strength. You know, it's like you have your faith, but you also have your doubts, and that in fact will make it strong. I feel like it could be interpreted either way. But then the very ending, we see her looking up at that demon, which I'm like, is that George? I can't tell. It looked like it was George, but maybe it's just some other demon. But she just kind of looks at him, so it's just like, so I guess that's why she kind of sees him almost every hour, because they're always kicking it in her room or just around the church. Either way, this episode set up some really, really interesting stuff. I'm so fascinated to see where everything ends up taking us going forward from here. Like I said, are we going to do or is the rest of the season going to be about angels, or is it going to just go back to being demons next episode? Maybe there's a preview that shows that I don't watch the previews. I go into every episode being like, I have no idea what to fully expect, so I'm excited. I'm assuming because the way the show is structured, it always does that interesting thing. Like sometimes their cases are usually the next episode. So that happened in season 1, and I believe in season 2. It's definitely, so I'm assuming that possession case that they got at the end of this episode is going to be the next episode as well. Just because the show typically tees up its next storylines like that, which is such an interesting thing. But I'm excited to see what goes down next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. To the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.